Hello, everyone. First, I want to begin by thanking each of you for joining me today. We'll spend just short of an hour or so together. And I know you have a lot of commitments, your personal lives, your work lives, your volunteer causes. You have a lot of things you could be doing instead of spending about an hour with me today. So I'm very grateful. And I hope that you will find at least something in the content that about which we'll be talking that could be useful to the learners whom you teach or your own child who experiences deaf blindness. My name is Susan Bachinski. I live in Kansas City, Missouri, and I'm absolutely thrilled that Dr. McKittrick, the director of the Idaho Project for Children and Youth with Deaf Blindness, has worked with me to build out a series of 3 modules um, to share with you about deaf blindness. The first one's basic communication principles and communication reminders. The second one is about the development of symbolization skills. And this one is about the development of communicative intentionality. I do want to reassure you that if you haven't watched each of the other 2, that's fine. The content I'll be discussing with you today should stand on its own. Um, I will be making references particularly to the recorded module on symbolization. So maybe if you like what you hear today and you haven't viewed the recording on symbolization, maybe you'll want to go back and do that. But this will stand on its own. I hope, I think it planned it that way. So let's get started. Let me share my screen with you and we'll get underway. All right. So as I said, we're going to be talking about developing communicative intentionality. And that's using communication with a purpose, with a goal, for the distinct reason of getting some other person to do something. All right. And we'll develop this throughout our discussion today. I have identified 4 major learning objectives. I think they're all important. I wouldn't put them on this slide. We're going to talk about the key elements of a continuum through which intentionality develops. We'll talk about the process and what each of the primary stages consists of, what the skills look like in the stage. 3, this is the trickiest one, in my opinion, is differentiating between what is intentional behavior and communicative intentionality. That's tricky. And that is a super important difference that if you don't have a clue what I'm talking about right now, it's fine. Please don't worry about it. If you don't know in 40 minutes, then I'm worried. Okay. Then you need to use my email, which is at the end, to get in touch with me. And we'll conclude with a few strategies that you may use as educational team members or family members to try to help the children or youth you know who experience deaf blindness and maybe don't communicate intentionally to begin to develop those skills and be able to do that. So let's get started with an exploration about the background. What happens? What goes on to result in communicative intentionality? So we'll start with the definition. This involves 2 parts, and that's where it gets tricky. If you have watched the symbolization recording, the stages are much more distinct in the development of symbolization skills than they are with intentionality. And that's because this is tricky. Or it's tricky because there's 2 parts. Communicative intentionality involves the deliberate pursuit of a goal. I am fully well aware that I want something to happen. I want somebody to give me something, leave me alone, take me somewhere, give me attention. I've got a goal in mind. But it's not only that I have a goal in mind, having the goal in mind and deliberately wanting to achieve it is part 1. Part 2 is I also, to be fully communicatively intentional, I have to be aware of some means to achieve that goal. If I scream a certain way and that makes you attend to me, if I hit you and that makes you attend to me, if I throw something across the room and that makes you attend to me, and I'm doing it on purpose, All right. And those two words are very important. And I'm doing it on purpose. 6 very important words. So to be fully communicatively intentional, the learner has to deliberately be in pursuit of a goal and have a means in mind for achieving that goal. And these are the criteria we use to differentiate what constitutes intentional behavior versus intentional communication. I'm just introducing this notion here. We will develop it, blow it up in the slides that are to come. Intentional behavior, pardon me, I said that wrong. I'm sorry. I'm pointing at intentional communication and I read it wrong. Intentional communication is just that. I'm intending to have some kind of impact on another person, not just on objects, not just on equipment, not just on furniture, not just on toys. I am intending to impact another individual. And if you have listened to either of the other recordings, you know that for communication to happen, there has to be a loop. There has to be somebody who sends a message and somebody who receives that message. Then the receiver sends a message back, hopefully, right? So there's always at least one other person involved. If you have only one person acting, one learner who experiences deafblindness acting on toys or the environment or furniture, and there's not a person, there might be intentional behavior, but there's not intentional communication, because to have communication, you have to have that loop. Okay, and that's described in the first recorded module. And we will continue to talk about this. I just want to reference those other recordings in case you've seen them. Okay. So our purpose today and our focus today is to realize that many learners who experience deafblindness, they move more slowly through the developmental phase of using their behavior intentionally. All right. You know that typically kids with deafblindness do develop more slowly, but this is especially true also in regard to using behaviors on purpose. They engage in certain behaviors because they feel good. That's what we generally refer to as stereotypy. Sometimes the stereotypy even results in self-abusive behavior because kids' thresholds for sensation are so low, they have to almost hurt themselves, damage themselves in some way to be able to feel something. Now, on the other extreme, some kids with deafblindness are so highly sensitive, they're hypersensitive to stimuli coming in from the environment. But many kids aren't, and so they use these stereotypies, they use behaviors on purpose because of how it makes them feel. It relieves tension, it calms them, it gives them something on which they can focus other than darkness and silence, depending on their degrees of sensory loss. But just because they're engaging in those behaviors intentionally, it doesn't automatically mean they're using those same behaviors in an intentionally communicative way. All right, for example, let's say I'm sitting on the floor. I'm a learner with deafblindness in your class or in your family, and I'm sitting on the floor and I'm banging my head against the cement block wall that's behind me. And I'm doing it on purpose. All right. I'm doing it because when I do that, I see stars. And if my vision is so bad that mostly I just see light and darker, and at night I don't really see anything, but when I bang my head, I see flashes or I feel the vibration in my skull, whereas normally I don't feel a lot of things because people don't interact with me a lot. So I'm doing that for me. Bang my head, feels good. All right. Even though to us, when we see a child or a young adult do that, we cringe, right? But to that learner, it must feel good. And so that learner is using that behavior intentionally. Now let's ramp it up a level. All right. Let's go back and we're going to get to this second part, intentional communication. Let's take the same scenario. Now I'm sitting on the floor in your classroom or in our family home, and I'm banging my head. And in my mind, I don't have the language to say this the way that I'm saying it to you. But in my mind, it's like, okay, I'm going to sit here and bang my head because I know if I bang my head, and my dad sees me, he's going to come over and talk to me. He's going to come over and wrestle with me. He's going to come over and play with me. You see the difference? In the second scenario, I'm going to bang my head because it's going to make somebody come and interact with me. Impact on another person. That is communicative intentionality. And that's why it's so tricky. Because until you become familiar with a learner's patterns of behavior, just by looking at the behavior itself, what it looks like, what it sounds like, what it feels like, if a child is hitting you, squeezing you, pinching you, you can't know just from the behavior. You have to take the whole context. And if you see differences, maybe the child bangs his or her head lightly, until they feel footsteps on the floor or hear a person, and then they really bang because it's like, okay, I want somebody. And it's the I want somebody to come and help me, pay attention to me, that makes it intentionally communicative. And we'll continue to talk about this, but I wanted to share that example early. Children who are typically developing ordinarily acquire communicative intentionality pretty darn quickly. And almost all those kids who are typically developing, acquire communicative intentionality without being directly taught. They learn it just incidentally by interacting with their families and their preschool and their peers and siblings. They just pick up that skill. Kids with deafblindness, especially those kids with more severe vision and hearing losses, they don't. We have to teach them. All right. So development of intentional communication is critically important. It's how I, as an individual in the world, can let other people know what I want, what I need, what makes me happy, what I want to do. It gives me quality of life. It lets me have a voice. And I don't necessarily mean speech, but it lets me have a voice. If it's sign or manual sign or picture exchange or whatever it is, it's how I let another person, because we have to have two people, it's how I let another person know what's going on inside of me. And without intentional communication, a person cannot do that. But also for kids who experience deafblindness, especially those with more severe losses, and this is a generalization, it isn't always true for every single case, all right? But it can be incredibly challenging. In the literature, for those of you who read professional literature, maybe not everybody does, family members often don't, that's fine, it's fine. You may see the word pre-intentional. And if you've read about pre-intentional, that's the same stage that I will call non-intentional. It's the first stage, all right? It's the first stage of development that we're going to explore. And there's nothing wrong with saying pre-intentional. I just prefer to say non-intentional because in my mind, if you say pre, there is this implication that communicative intentionality will absolutely follow. And with some learners who experience deafblindness, it won't. Some learners who experience deafblindness will likely not develop full communication intentionality in all environments with all partners, and that's okay. We as their partners have to structure the context and structure the environment and build supports to help those kids and youth make their needs and wants known. But to me, pre says, okay, just hang on long enough, folks, and the other will come. And it won't necessarily in my experience. So as we move on through our time together today, we're going to look at the sequence through which communicative intentionality develops. And different authors, different researchers will talk about all different numbers of stages. And for those of you who have seen the symbolization module, you go, she said the same thing there. And yes, I did. That's correct. I did say the same thing there. Some authors will talk about 4 stages. Some authors will talk about 6 stages. Some authors will talk about 9 stages. And for me, I don't think it's an incorrect or erroneous oversimplification to just talk about 3. It's that old KISS principle. Maybe some of you've heard of it. Keep it simple, stupid. I'm not saying you're stupid. I'm saying it helps me to keep it simple. Okay. So we are going to talk about non-intentional communication. We're going to talk about transitional intentionality. And this is where that difference comes in and is so important. In the transitional stage, the learner is engaging in the behavior on purpose. I'm banging my head because it makes me feel good. I'm banging my head because I see stars and I feel vibration. But I'm not doing it to get anything from anybody else. I'm not doing it to affect another person. When communication is fully intentional, what I call communicative intentionality, the behavior is intentional and intentionally communicative. All right. That is, I'm doing it on purpose and I'm doing it to get somebody else to do something. I'm doing the behavior on purpose. I'm engaging in the behavior on purpose, and it's for the purpose of affecting another person. Some people split this out. And for, again, if you looked at the symbolization one, this can involve, this fully intentional stage can involve what I call the transitional symbolic stage and the abstract symbolic stage. It definitely involves the abstract symbolic stage and sometimes this one. And if you're not aware of that, don't worry about it. It's not a problem. Just try to keep these 3 points separate in your minds. So let's explore these in a little bit more detail. In the non-intentional stage of communicative development, the learner, regardless of age, if the learner is 2 or 7 or 12 or 19 or 24, all right, which is a young adult at that point, the kinds of signals, the kinds of overt behaviors in which the learner engages could be unique to that individual. That's what idiosyncratic means. He makes his own sounds, squeaks, grunts, yells, has his own movements. Some of them might be funny, quirky movements. Some of them may be movements that other people use, but he uses them for a different way. There are things unique to him. Sometimes kids will push things off their wheelchair tray or their bedside table or their desk, and whereas with a lot of kids who have more intentional development, they could be pushing that off to try to get you to come over there and give them something different to do because they're bored or they don't like that task or something. But maybe kids are just engaging in that movement because something's there and they bad at it just because it's something to engage them. So it doesn't necessarily, the way it looks doesn't necessarily have to be totally different from what other people do, but what the learner does at the non-intentional stage doesn't have conventional meaning. Kids just do things, all right? And we'd say, well, they do it to see what happens, but that implies that they are internally processing, I wonder what's going to happen if I pour this glass of water on the floor. It's not that cognitively purposeful. It's just like, well, there's something there, and so I'm going to swat at it. Because kids who experience deafblindness, especially kids with more severe sensory losses, they live inside their bodies. We have to invite them out into the world to join us, and so they do things that to some other people might look a little bit strange. Non-intentional communicative behaviors are very context driven. Maybe when kids go into environments that aren't familiar to them, they seem more agitated. So they'll demonstrate more aggressive behaviors or agitated behaviors. If it's sounds, if it's just not being able to be calm, if it's thrashing in a chair, if it's just pushing people away. But if they're home with their family, with a dog, if they're in a classroom with their favorite para, they might not be as agitated. So there's just the difference in context. Context does affect non-intentional behavior to an incredible degree. And this third one, it's really long, but I didn't know how to make it short, so I apologize. The learner begins to realize the power of communication, because sometimes coincidentally, when a kid would knock something off on the floor, somebody's going to come over there. Even if the learner didn't knock it off on the floor to get somebody to come, coincidentally, sometimes somebody's going to come. So kids can begin and will begin to connect the dots that, and again, they don't have this language, inner language, but it's like, wow, I did something and something happened. And after enough time, they begin to move down this continuum to the second stage that we're going to call transitional in just a minute. So kids begin to realize that these communication things have power, but the learner doesn't realize at this point that she can purposefully or intentionally, because it's not intentional, use her behaviors to influence another person. Okay? They don't know that at this non-intentional stage. So let's add transitional. In this middle stage, the behaviors, that's what we see, what we hear, what we feel, might be conventional or not. They still might be weird, quirky things that are unique to that learner herself. But the learner does have the behavior under control. Remember the head thing, the concrete? That's under the learner's control. Okay? The behavior is under the learner's control. And generally, the behaviors you see from a learner who is transitionally intentional in the right context with familiar partners and familiar events and familiar schedules, you can often, you, the partner, can often derive the meaning that might be behind that, or that we could shape to be behind that. Maybe there's no meaning at all at this point, but you say, she does this a lot. She does this a lot when Jimmy's around. She does this a lot when Susie's around. She doesn't ever do this when Christopher's around. You start looking for these patterns so that we can scaffold and shape intentionality. So intentionality does begin to dawn at this stage as kids begin to connect more dots. And you'll begin to see purposeful, intentional communication emerge maybe in the most familiar environment with the most favorite partner, something like that. When you get to communication that is fully intentional, so this point is critically important. This first point right here. The way the behavior looks could still be very strange. And by that, I mean unusual. I shouldn't have said strange. It could be very unusual. It could still be, I'm going to beat on the side of my DVD player. If you still have a DVD player, I'm going to beat on the side of my bed when I want you to come get me out of my bed. Most kids don't beat on the side of their bed when they want you to get them out of their bed, or beat on their iPad when they want you to put on music. They'll call, or they'll sign, or they'll hand you the iPad, or they'll do something more conventional. So the form can still be unconventional, but the reason, the purpose, the intention is deliberate. All right, so don't get hung up on form. Form could still be quirky and unconventional, not shared by everybody. That's what it looks like, what it sounds like, not what everybody else would do, but it's on purpose. Communication becomes independent of context. So kids are able and do engage in communication intentionally, whether they're in their favorite singular environment or they're in other familiar environments. It's multiple environments, multiple partners, multiple activities. And this, you'll see this several times, but this is the most important point about intentionality. When a learner's fully intentional, she uses her behavior for the distinct purpose of affecting another individual. Peer, parent, teacher, para, doesn't matter, but another person. All right. So you should have, I hope, picked up on some patterns in the last group of 3 slides. The importance of the context really diminishes till maybe intentional communication doesn't rely on context hardly at all unless kids get really anxious in strange places. So the importance of context diminishes as kids move from non-intentional to transitional to fully intentional. The magnitude of the partner's role diminishes because, again, you and I, we can communicate with people we know, people we don't know. We can communicate in most contexts, maybe not if we're totally terrified or lost or in a country where we don't speak the language or something, but most contexts, most partners, much less important. And the purposeful effect on the partner absolutely increases. So context and partner, these become less important, but the purposeful effect on a partner increases. I'm going to do this. I want to see if you do this. I want to do something to see if you'll do something. We really don't think there's anything purposeful. We're not aware of anything purposeful going on when a learner is in the non-intentional stage. Okay? So maybe those summaries will be helpful. I hope so. So let's take a closer examination. We've done an overview of those three stages and compared them and looked at context, partner role, and purpose. So let's dissect them a little bit more, and we're going to go in order. We'll start with the non-intentional stage. Again, I know some of this is repetitive, but it's just so important. So bear with me. Close your eyes for 3 seconds. In the non-intentional stage, the learner is neither deliberately pursuing a goal nor aware of a means to obtain the goal. The learner is just being. The learner is maybe emitting, producing some behaviors. Maybe it's because it makes them feel better. Maybe it's because it makes some sensation happen. We don't know why, but many kids, except the kids who are super passive and internal, and we have to get them out to join us in the world, they do things, all right? So we're going to pick up on the things they do, but it's not deliberately pursuing a goal or how to get the goal. So at this stage, the partner must watch, observe, make notes about things like I said before. This learner always does X when Susie's around. She always does X when Jimmy's around. She never does X when Christopher's around. We're going to make notes. We're going to watch for patterns. And then we as teams, educational teams that involve families, we are going to decide how we're going to interpret that behavior. And we're going to interpret that behavior as if it was intentional, all right? And we might be right in our guess. We might be wrong. So that's why you have to have notes, you have to have data, you have to make observations over time. I don't mean over 8 months, but over some extended period of time. Share notes with the family, share notes with team members, and say, I think she swats out when people are closer to her. And so I think she swats out to try to say, come pay attention to me, come interact with me. Maybe it's the opposite. Maybe she swats out to say, don't come in my space, leave me alone. But the only way we're going to figure that out is if everybody on the team says, we think she swats out. And that's not how most people ask, right? For attention. But we think she swats out to say, come pay attention to me. So all partners are going to say, that's how we're going to treat it. And if we see her do that thing, we are going to go approach her and we're going to say this, we're going to do this, and we're going to try to engage her. Maybe we're going to touch her and say, hi, Jenny, I'm here. Maybe we're going to say, you want a tickle? I don't know what you're going to say. It's going to depend on the age and what the learner likes and prefers, all those things. But we're going to treat those behaviors, that SWAT, as if it were intentional. And if all partners interpret that SWAT or whatever the behaviors are consistently in the same way and repeatedly over time, you and your team will shape communicative intentionality with that learner. You will. Again, non-intentional behaviors, they're typically idiosyncratic. That's unique to that individual learner. Banging on the side of the bed, banging on the side of the TV, knocking things on the ground. Some of the behaviors you will see are also reflexes. Many kids who experience deafblindness have pretty severe motor challenges. And so you will see that if their head turns, they show the asymmetric tonic neck reflex. You don't want to build on reflexive behaviors. kids, babies, when they're stroked by on the side, they get touch on the side of their face, they'll turn that way. You don't want to build on reflexes because reflexes aren't under that learner's control. You will see kids do things that appear to be random. You don't know why they do what they do. And this is especially frustrating to us as teams when they're challenging things, right? We say, oh, it's challenging behavior, challenging behavior. And I would urge you to say, no, it's just communicative behavior we don't understand. It's potential communicative behavior that we don't understand what she wants, what she needs, what she means. So we have to find or impose patterns on what appears to be random. Also, at this stage, many kids' bodies are just still controlled by behavior state. That's the level of alertness of their neurological systems, whether they're asleep, whether they're alert and ready to learn. I mean, neurologically ready to learn, if they're dazed, if they're drowsy. This is that notion that when any baby, a typically developing baby comes home from the hospital, when that kid's asleep, you can't wake him up because behavior state, neurologically, is sleep. And with young kids who are typically developing, behavior state integrates pretty quickly. But with kids that experience deafblindness, it doesn't. So you want to watch for behavior state and find those times of the day, the periods of activity, days of the week, whatever, when the kid demonstrates the most alert behavior and not the sleepy, drowsy behavior. We can talk about receptive and expressive communication. I did that a lot in the first module. With non-intentional, the expressiveness, or the way that learner sends the message to we as partners who are going to interpret it, all right? It's idiosyncratic, it's behavior state. We just said that. It's very driven by context. These kids, if they are aware of where they are, and I think they're aware much more than we often give them credit for, who's with them, where they are, if it's cold, if it's warm, if it's noisy, if it's quiet, if there's wind, if there's white noise, they pick up on those cues. Kids learn the power of communication. In terms of what they get, what they receive from us as partners, they send a message, get a message, send a message, get a message. What kids comprehend at this stage is the tone of the speaker's voice and the physical contact or touch from the partner, all right? Kids don't understand the spoken words at this point. I'm not advocating that when you interact with a child or young adult who's non-intentional, that you don't talk or that you don't sign. Definitely talk, definitely sign, but use keywords and key phrases and don't engage in what I call verbal diarrhea, where you say, okay, here we go, we're going to have lunch. You ready to have lunch? I'll bet you're hungry. Ooh, I'll bet your tummy's growling because you haven't had anything for 3 hours, and here's a snack, and now we're going to go over here, and you see what I mean? Don't do that. Say, lunchtime, hungry, and just use the telegraphic words and use that exaggerated motherese kind of tone of voice, because that's what is going to be meaningful to a learner who's non-intentional. So let's talk about transitional intentionality. We're into stage 2, the middle column. In this stage, the learner is deliberately engaging in behavior, doing stuff on purpose, and banging my head on purpose, but not with a mental plan for obtaining a desired goal. One thing really does change in this stage. Partners may often use context to derive meaning from the learner's behavior. So if you as a team are being attentive, you will start to get cues in context, because learners' behaviors will start to differentiate themselves in different contexts when they start to become transitional. Again, the behavior is intentional. The behavior is under the learner's control. The behavior is not used to communicate intentionally. The behavior is generally meaningful in context. Again, maybe I bang my head on this concrete wall, but when I'm sitting in my wheelchair, which has a padded headrest, I don't bang my head. So it's different. It's meaningful in different contexts. But the learner does not yet fully realize she can use her behavior to influence another person's behavior. She still doesn't realize she can use her behavior to affect another person. Let's look again at expressive receptive, that loop. Send a message, get a message, send a message, get a message. Okay. Intentionality, full communicative intentionality dawns in this stage. You'll begin to see the emergence of purposeful communication with one certain favored partner, with one certain favored environment or activity. Context still contributes, but much less so than for learners who are non-intentional. And at this stage, receptively, that learner is showing comprehension of some words. Those could be spoken or signed, all right, spoken or signed, and some simple directives in context. One of my funniest stories was I was working with a teacher in a classroom, and she was telling me how this learner with deafblindness, still a fair amount of good vision left, field loss, acuity loss, but some functional vision, pretty moderate to hearing loss, but not totally severe. And I was trying to do a communication assessment, and I was saying, there's not really strong intentional behavior. There's not strong symbolic behavior. I really don't think she understands the things you're telling her to do. And the teacher was insistent. I said, what do you mean? She said, well, when at the end of the day, I say, everybody put your things away, get your backpacks, get in line to go home. Tamara does that. And I'm like, okay. And in my mind, I'm thinking, oh, lady, I want to believe you, but I don't think so. Nothing I'm seeing supports that, right? So the next time I was in her room observing, I said, would you say that and do that the way you did that to let me see what Tamara does? And she did. And there was this delay. And Tamara watched everybody else, and she followed what her classmates did. Yes, she finally put her stuff away, got her backpack, and got in line. Another way you can play with this, and I did this with a different teacher, and I hope you don't think I sound like a terrible person, but I was trying to prove that kids don't necessarily understand all these words or all these signs. This example only applies when it's spoken language, but I asked the teacher if I could give a directive, and I used the same inflection. I don't remember what the words were I said, but I said something like, okay, everybody, let's pretend like today is April Fool's Day, and in an hour, we're going to go to the coat rack and go outside. And I tried to say it with the same intonation, and the kid put her stuff away, got up, got her backpack, and got in line, and then was like looking around. It's the tone of voice, it's the words. You have to be careful to not misinterpret, okay? Context is still tied to comprehension. Now we're in the last stage, fully intentional communicative behavior. And in this stage, the learner is deliberately engaging in some behavior, even if it's challenging behavior, challenging to you, inappropriate, whatever you want to call it. The learner's deliberately engaging in that behavior for some kind of purpose, even if the way it looks, like say, kids will engage in challenging behavior intentionally to get you to do something that they want if it's the only way they can get your attention. So that's an unconventional form of behavior, to bite somebody to get your attention. It's an unconventional form to throw something across the room. It's idiosyncratic to beat on the table when you're bored, stiff, and you want a different activity. But it's still deliberate, and it's for the purpose of getting you to give the kids something else to do. So the learner is pursuing a goal and has a mental plan. The learner uses his behavior for the distinct purpose of affecting another person. So therefore, one of the most important takeaways from our time together today is to be deemed a genuine communicative interaction, at least one other person must be involved. Kids can do as many things as you want on purpose with objects, with stuffed animals, with furniture, but if they are not doing something to genuinely involve another person or genuinely affect another person, it's not communication. Intentional communication is used to impact another person positively or negatively. Kids don't care. And especially when they're learning, if they haven't had a conventional communication structure, they're going to use whatever means they have available. And it's often challenging behavior or unique behavior, idiosyncratic behavior, till we teach them other behaviors to substitute. They don't know, well, that's appropriate, that's not appropriate. They don't know those things. We have to respond, and they are just trying to affect us either positively or negatively, but they're trying to get a response. Most learners, when they hit the fully intentional stage, will likely use some conventional gestures, some conventional vocalizations, even if it's like, hey, those are conventional gestures for, hey, I want attention, or hey, I have a pain, or some signs, even if it's a put their hand up, even if it's a raise their arms, even if it's just put their hand out. Some things are going to start to look conventional, but not necessarily everything. The learner will possibly demonstrate concrete symbolic expressions. Again, if you are familiar with that second module, that's like three-dimensional objects. Kids will act on objects and use them to communicate intention, like taking a cup and shoving it at you if they want more water, or if they don't like what's in that glass, they want you to give them something else to drink, or they'll take the cup and they'll knock it on the floor, or they'll take the cup and throw it down, but they'll use objects at this stage. So the context and partners are important, but much, much, much less so. Much less so. You have to have a partner to have communication, but much less so. So let's look at the expressive and receptive. When you hit the intentional communication stage, it's the beginning of true symbolic expression. It's when kids truly use their first words, whether their first words are spoken words or their first words are signed words, and kids become able to communicate independently of context. Context can still support their communication. They might go, pointing at what they want because they don't know the name of it. So the context supports their communication, but they learn to communicate independently of context. And kids are able to comprehend spoken words. They're able to comprehend manual signs. And actually, what they're able to comprehend is more than what they're able to produce, or their comprehension is more than what they're able to express. And that's true with all of us. If you think of yourself, there's a lot of words in this PowerPoint, for example, that you understand. You understand all these words, maybe 99.9% of the words, but I'm guessing that in your day-to-day conversation, you don't use all these words, even though you know what they mean. They're not in your vocabulary you use for typical day-to-day expression. I know with myself, when I had to write, as a faculty member, you have to do professional writing. I used a lot of vocabulary in my professional writing that I never used in my day-to-day life because I had to. I knew what those words meant, but I didn't typically use them. So let's summarize this, and I have a video to try to illustrate it for you with one of the little guys you've met in my previous modules, if you've watched them. Development of intentional communication down that continuum, right? From non-intentional to transitional to fully intentional communication. It does not proceed from left to right in a single smooth way. It'll go up and back and up and back and up and back and back if kids get really sick or they have surgery and get in the hospital. And then it'll go up and then they get a new classroom teacher and it'll go back. Or if they're in a foster home, it'll go up and then they get moved out of that foster home and it'll go back. And it's a back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. But we hope that ultimately, even if it's going back and forth, we're moving in the direction of full intentionality on the far right. You also know, and I said this about symbolization, so yes, it's the same, a shift from one of those three columns, non-intentional, transitional, fully intentional, a shift from one level to the next level doesn't occur overnight, nor does it occur simultaneously in regard to all communication interactions, right? Because I've said, let me go back for a second. There are differences in the use of intentionality with familiar partners, familiar environments versus unfamiliar situations, a substitute teacher, a substitute para, and that's what I'm getting at here. Sometimes families will see much more intentional communication or will be better able to interpret intentional communication than school teams, especially when a child starts in a new preschool or a new elementary or a new middle school and there's a new educational team. I just encourage you to talk to the families because you need to get their information to be able to build the intentionality in that new school environment. Now we'll move on. You will notice that on those charts I had, I didn't have silos. I didn't have lines drawn to distinguish the non-intentional, transitional, and fully intentional because they're not differentiated by distinct boundaries. I've imposed those three main levels to try to tell you what I think the key behaviors are that show development, what I think the key elements are that show progression, all right? And kids will demonstrate skills at multiple points along that continuum with how they're feeling, with if it's Monday morning versus Wednesday afternoon, if they're living with dad versus living with mom, if they have a regular teacher versus a substitute teacher, if they're with a physical therapist as opposed to a speech pathologist, all those kinds of things, kids might perform differently. And a lot of it is linked to familiarity with that learner on the part of the partner. And some of it is just preference, right? Think about yourself. There are certain people you talk more openly. I shouldn't say talk. You communicate more openly and freely with than others. Kids are the same way. Kids who experience deafblindness are the same way. And I think we often don't cut them that slack. So kids do demonstrate skills at multiple points along the continuum, but we will generally describe them by the stage, either non-intentional, transitional, or fully communicatively intentional, by where the majority of their skills seem to fall. I think I've said this enough times. Didn't know where to put this slide, but it's so important. Different skills with familiar and unfamiliar partners, different skills with familiar and unfamiliar environments. Maybe because I've said it a lot, that makes the point that it's really important. So, in order to help kids transition to conventional, intentional communication, these are some things that I haven't talked about yet today, but they play into the equation as well. Communicative messages are most readily understood by members of the same culture, right? Culture and communication are really intertwined. And I haven't mentioned that word culture yet today, and I would be remiss to not do it. In some cultures, individuals will intentionally turn their head to the side to show respect to another person, to an elder, to a new person, to a teacher. They'll turn their head to the side out of respect, all right? And in other cultures, and I think it's true in a lot of American culture, even if it's not, we're not always aware of it, we'll turn our heads away when we're afraid, or we turn our heads away when we see something gross or disgusting, we don't look at it anymore, or we'll turn our heads away out of fear. And those are really different messages. Now, that may be extreme, right? But it's the notion of culture. We can talk about it with eye contact. We can talk about it with when you're walking with a child. In some cultures, children are expected to walk or roll their wheelchair or their walker behind the adult who's with them. And you might want to say, come on, come up here with me. I want you to walk with me. And it's like, he's been taught at home, he's supposed to walk back. Whereas if we generally in schools, when we're partnering with a kid, we want them to walk with us, and we can hold their hand if they're 3 years old, but we don't want to hold their hand if they're 17 years old, all right, which gets into the next thing. but it's like you want them to be with you, right? So I'm not saying we can't teach those things, but we have to be aware that there's a super impactful cultural influence. All right. That's very important to remember. The second thing gets at that notion of age. What is a conventional, acceptable communicative form has to be considered in conjunction with that learner's age. Like I said, if you work with preschool kids, you might hold their hand when you're walking them in from recess or to the cafeteria or to you're the speech path or the OT or the PT or the adaptive PE teacher, and you're going to hold their hand when you're going to go to a setting to do some work. Or you allow kids to sit on your lap, which isn't it sad that we have to worry about that in schools right now? Or you allow little kids to give you a hug after vacation. But when you're working with 18-year-old and 19-year-old adolescents who are bigger and stronger than you don't want to greet them with a hug. That's not appropriate, because if you teach them they can greet you with a hug, you being their educational team, I'm talking about the families on this one. Of course, the families are going to hug their kids, but then they're going to hug people on the street. I worked with one young man, his name is AJ, and his thing to do was when he saw a woman that he thought, a young girl, a woman that was attractive, he would run up and hug her. And he almost got arrested in a Walmart one day for doing that. So we have to think about age, all right? And we have to remember that we really want to try to replace idiosyncratic, unconventional forms with more conventional forms of vocalization or words or manual signs. And conventional simply means what everybody else in that culture uses. Out of respect, we don't say, get over here, get your butt over here. We say, can you come here, please? Or come here, please. We don't just throw something at somebody to get them to come over here. It's whatever is conventional that is used by the majority of people in the culture. Again, culture, age, and movement in the direction of what is used by everybody in the region. Let's leave it at that. So I put together this chart, and there's a similar chart in the symbolization module. And I said then, so I'm going to say now, the line I didn't want to put on here was this line right here, because these ages are loosey-goosey, maybe estimate. Don't get hung up on these ages, please, 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 please. I put them here to show you how relatively quickly kids who are typically developing move through to intentional communication. Many kids who are typically developing will be fully intentional by the time they're 1 year old. Many kids with deaf blindness won't come close to that. I also put these on here for you to see how short this transitional stage is when kids start hooking it up and connecting the dots to go from non-intentional to intentional. But we have to pay attention to when only the behavior is intentional, even if it's not intentionally communicative, because that's when we can intervene and help shape the intentionality and move the behavior over here. I put these words down here for those of you who are speech pathologists, because I know you study the perlocutionary, illocutionary, locutionary work of Bates and her team, and that's basically where these fit. And if you don't know what those words are, don't worry about it. It's okay. Doesn't matter. Perlocutionary basically describes non-intentional and so on and so forth. So let's look at our little guy here. This is James, and it's an example of an activity that is fully intentional. It's also fully symbolic. He wants me, he loves this light bright, and it doesn't show up really well, but I tried to film it in the dark room so that the lights would show up better and you couldn't see him and what he was doing. And it's more important to see him because he loves the light bright and he could see it. And he doesn't have the motor skill to put the little lights into the holes. So he needs me to help. but I require him to communicate with me. And it's not just he's there with me. I require him to communicate with me by making eye contact with me and looking at me to say, put it in, Susan. And part of what I'm doing is I'm doing a vocal imitation thing with him too, trying to move his communication to more symbolic forms. And what he does, I will echo back to him. So there's a lot going on in here. I do also want to give you a disclaimer to try to find a place that I could film this. He was a participant in a research study, but I wanted to film this activity. We couldn't bring in his good chair, so he is supported in this seat. He does have a support belt around him. You can see a little bit of it right here. He is not tied in that chair as a restraint. Okay, I have to say that because you might go, she's got him tied, that's a restraint. He gets so excited, and you will see him. He gets so excited, and his motor control is not good. He has had a stroke, and so he has very poor motor control on one side of his body, and he would fall out of that chair. And he doesn't mind that belt for support. So he really doesn't. It's really okay. All right. So let you take a look at this. Here we go.
Yes, that's pretty. Hey. Hi. Hi.
See, he's not looking at me, so I won't do what he wants.
Put it in, okay? Put it in. Yeah.
And I won't let him take it from me.
Put it in.
And see how he's looking at me? To say, yeah, yeah.
Put it in. Yeah.
See how he glances at me? I won't let him have it because he can't put it in. He'll just throw it.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, yeah. Put it in, okay, yeah. Ooh. Ooh.
And I think you heard how he does do some imitation, and some of his approximations are pretty good. So I think you could see he's got to involve me. He can't just randomly take my hand and say, put it in there and never pay attention to me if he's zoning out with the lights and the ceiling and all those things. So let's wind this up. What should team members do? What should you do? We're almost done. What should you do? All right. There are some cues that you can look for to reinforce. If kids shift their attention, in the literature, this is called gaze shift. I don't say gaze shift because with many of our learners with deaf blindness, they don't have enough vision to shift their gaze, right? But they'll shift their attention. They'll hear something over here, and then they'll hear something over here, or they'll hear it over here and they'll lean. They shift, or they'll search. They'll shift attention from over here to over here. So it's some kind of shift in attention. That shows an awareness, an environmental awareness. Capture that. It's like, in a tennis match, you watch this. If there's a cup and you see the child going, look at the cup, look at you, look at the cup, look at you. That's an attention shift. You might not know what he wants. He might be saying, what's in there? He might be saying, I want some. Where's my cup? Give me a drink. Ooh, I hope that's not that nasty stuff you made me drink. You like it? I mean, we don't know the meaning, but the shifting of the attention, the systematic shifting of attention can be a cue that you can build on to say, okay, let's grab that. Let's find a response to it so we can see if we can shape intentionality. Some kids will be just reluctant. They're just hesitant and they hang back and they don't want you to prompt them. They don't want you to help them. Maybe it's fear, maybe it's anxiety, maybe it's uncertainty about what's going to happen. But that reluctance could mean, I'm scared, I'm afraid, I don't feel well. You got to tell me what you're going to do before you touch me. I need information. Again, it's a litany of what it could mean, but pay attention. Again, if you think of your circle of friends, when you would go out to dinner together, you go to someone's party, a baby shower, a wedding, I don't know. Some people are very gregarious and very talkative, and some people will speak when they're spoken to. They're not rude, but they're quiet. They're reluctant to initiate. They don't want to, quote, be the center of attention. I'm not sure that we, as educational team members for kids with deaf blindness, allow that range of personality in all the learners with whom we work. Some kids, they just hang back. You need to give them more information. Ready to go? And you touch their wheelchair just a little bit. Have you ever seen somebody come up behind a kid who uses a chair and go and push him off down the hall without giving him any warning? That to me ought to be a crime. Okay. You've got to give them information. I'm going to touch you here. I'm going to pick you up. I'm going to change your diaper. I'm going to fix your G tube. Maybe they need information. They're just hesitant. They don't know. They don't feel secure. They don't feel safe. They can't really see the world and hear the world in typical ways. You got to give them information. Be reluctant too. Kind of the flip side is persistence. If a kid is going to keep pulling on your shirt, pull on your shirt, pull, 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 not stop, just pull and pull, and you're ignoring it. You have that, quote, behavior on extinction. I'm saying, please don't have that behavior on extinction. Please interpret that behavior as communication. What does pull, 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 pull mean? If it means get away from me, then the pulling is going to stop when you leave. All right. If it means get me out of this side liar, if finally when you start to take off the straps of the side lying, this persistence stops, okay, that's termination of the behavior because you finally are doing what the kid wanted. But they're going to persist until you do something. All right. Those are clues to intentionality, to full intentionality. I'm doing this to make you do something to me. Make this better. All right. Another thing, I jumped ahead to termination of the behavior once the goal is achieved. When the straps come off, you're going to get them out of the side layer. They quit pulling on your shirt. Duh. Okay. There's also this thing called recasting, that if you're going to pull on your shirt, pull on your shirt, pull on your shirt, and it doesn't work, then they're going to start hitting you. Right. And it still doesn't work. And by doesn't work means you're not paying attention. You're not giving the kid what he or she thinks she wants. Then they're going to bite you, or they're going to throw something. They're going to change the form till you pay attention to what they want. If you see those behaviors, you've got great cues to say, we've got a lot of stuff to work with here to build intentionality in a systematic, conventional way. Let's go, team. Okay. Communication partners should respond in a consistent fashion to signals that are potentially communicative, to attempts at communication, even if they're not appropriate, right? We should make concerted effort to have all family and educational team members respond in the same way, because as I said earlier, and maybe now it makes more sense, I hope it makes more sense, if all partners will repeatedly, consistently respond to or interpret kids' behaviors the same way over time, it will shape communicative intentionality. It will. So a summary, 2 slides for a summary and we're done. Symbolization skills and intentional communication. This is module 2. This is this module, module 3. They do emerge concurrently in children who are typically developing. Therefore, I encourage you as educational team members or family members who work with learners who experience deaf blindness to try to observe for symbolization or use of symbolic skills at the same time that you're looking for and trying to assess intentionality. And you'll serve the learners well, and you'll serve yourselves well if you try to encourage symbolic skill and intentionality at the same time. You don't have to, but you can enhance both if you are aware of both, because in kids who are typically developing, they do kind of feed off each other and develop hand in hand. There are some parallels that exist between the development of those two major categories, but it is absolutely critical to recognize that even when a learner's overt behavior could be fully communicatively intentional, the form might be unique to that learner. The form might be unconventional. The form might be what we call an inappropriate behavior. It still can be intentional, and we just need to keep this in mind and not forget it. In other words, please don't interpret quote challenging behavior as just kid being ornery, not following directions, being disobedient, blah, 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 blah. That challenging behavior means something. It has a communicative value. So with that, I'll let you go. This is my email. You're free to contact me. This is my cell phone. You're free to contact me. I'll leave it up there for a minute. Just to, of course, you could pause your computer, so I guess I don't have to do that. But I do want to sincerely thank you for taking 64 minutes, 65 minutes of your time today. And I hope that this has been valuable for you in some way. I hope that this gives you some new skills to put in your toolbox for helping facilitate communication growth of learners who experience deafblindness. And thanks again to Dr. McKittrick for your support. Best of luck. Thanks, everybody.